Hello, everybody. Mr. Cornwell here, back for more. Any guesses on where we're at today? That is correct. We are live from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Coming to you, the corner today is coming to you from Independence Hall, known as the Pennsylvania State House. Excuse me, I got a little hair problem this morning. Known as the Pennsylvania State House during the time of the Revolution. So today I thought we would go back to Philadelphia and do a short little biography on Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton was born in 1757 or 58. We don't really know because he was born in the Caribbean, not the 13 colonies. He's one of... What? Did you hear that? Oh, don't scare me like that. I thought Yankee Doodle Dandy was coming back. I don't think I can handle any more of that. So Hamilton is from the Caribbean. He was known as Boy Genius. His father abandoned his mother early on. His father was from Scotland and was a shipper. His mother's from the Caribbean islands. And he leaves her when Hamilton's just a little boy. And then she dies while he's still a young man, so he's technically an orphan. He's taken in by a couple of guys that run a shipping company who feel sorry for him and want to teach him a trade, and they realize that this young teenager is brilliant. He's a lot smarter than them. So within months, they're off jet-setting to other islands vacationing, and Hamilton's running the entire business, and they're making more money than they were before. So Hamilton actually shows up in the colonies at New York right before the Revolution, and he is sponsored by those two shippers. They believe that Hamilton is too big for the tiny islands in the Caribbean, and if that's the case, greatness lies in the colonies at this time period. So Alexander Hamilton shows up. He attends what's known as King's College. After the Revolution, it becomes Columbia University in New York City, and that's where Hamilton is when the war breaks out. Like many people, he drops out of school, enlists in the local militia, and because he's a college student, he is given the position of a junior staff officer. Hamilton catches a break early on in the war. He is basically introduced to George Washington, and Washington takes a liking to him. Washington sees his brilliance. He's a lot of things that Washington is, plus some that Washington wishes he would be. Washington, as you remember from our last video, was very brave. He led by example, led from the front. Hamilton, while he doesn't have the size that Washington does, has a lot of these same characteristics and traits. They used to call him the little lion. Tells you anything about his bravery. But also, he is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, boy genius. If you had one founding father to take your SAT for college, Hamilton would probably be your man. He is a financial wizard. It's why later on Washington selects him as the first Secretary of the Treasury, which means Hamilton basically creates the financial institution, the Bank of the United States, which begins the country off. He basically is the financial system of the United States early on. So when Hamilton is introduced to Washington, Washington takes him on as a staff officer, which means he's going to write a lot of reports, and quickly Washington listens to his advice. So the way Washington ran his army is he would go around to his staff officers that he trusted, he would get their opinions, and then he would make the final decision. Most times he would go with the majority of his staff, but not always, but most times he would. And Hamilton becomes one of those guys on Washington's staff. Now, Hamilton's not satisfied with that. Hamilton wants glory, he wants greatness, and he keeps itching and asking Washington for his own command. And eventually, later in the war, he plays a vital role, especially at the Battle of Yorktown, where it all ends. So that's Hamilton up to the Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, Hamilton is one of what we call the Federalists. That means he wanted a stronger central government. Now you know why some of his enemies called him King Alexander I behind his back. He was actively advocating Boy, that's tough to say. Say that twice in a row. He was actively advocating for a stronger central government at a time when they just spent the last 20 years revolting from the strongest central government on earth, King George III. So the articles were in place. They weren't working. Hamilton knew it. So Hamilton did everything in his powers, used his influence, and with Washington's backing, that's considerable influence, to change the articles. And eventually what comes out of that is what we call the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution of the United States. So Hamilton is a leading Federalist in the 1780s after the war, and he is one of the people pushing for this new Constitution, which would give the central government a lot more powers. So once the Constitution passes behind me right now, the State House in Philadelphia, it still doesn't replace the articles until the states approve it. So that takes time, that takes months, and even takes a couple of years for all 13 states to wind up approving it. In the time period, there are a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers that come out in New York, and they basically are pro-Constitution arguments. They are a series of persuasive essays of why the states should approve this new Constitution and give the central government more powers. Hamilton, out of the 85, Hamilton writes over 50 of those. Of course, at the time, they were written anonymously, but Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay write all 85 of them, and Hamilton writes the majority of the 85. So once the Constitution is put into effect, Washington becomes the first president, and Hamilton becomes his first Secretary of the Treasury Department, which is involved with the financial institutions of the United States. So boy genius is integral in getting the first Bank of the United States. It's his brainchild to handle the country's finances, and he's big on what they call assumption. Coffee break. Be right back. And Mr. Cornwell's back. Boy, that coffee tastes great. I need a coffee sponsor, so that way I can get some little revenue running in. Well, let's pick up with Hamilton. Hamilton is for assumption. To assume something financially means you take it over. In this case, the states all had Revolutionary War debts, especially the northern states, because they were much heavily in debt, because that's where most of the war took place, to European powers. So what Hamilton wanted to do, he wanted the new central government to assume or take on those state Revolutionary War debts. One, that would alleviate the state debts. Two, if and when we pay back those debts to Europe, that would give the new nation, the United States of America, a good standing credit in the eyes of the rest of the world. Of course, the Southerners were against this because, one, they had very little state debt because they weren't as heavily involved for the duration of the war. And two, most of the Southern colonies, including Virginia, the largest colony at the time, had already paid their state debts off by the time we get to the late 1780s and 1790s. So this was a major sticking point. Hamilton's pushing for assumption. Jefferson is one of the leading anti-federalists who are people against the strong Constitution, and they work out a deal, allegedly over a dinner one night. But here is basically the deal. Hamilton will get his Bank of the United States. Hamilton will get assumption. In return, the Southerners, who greatly distrust Hamilton, the money men, and a lot of people in the North, will get the nation's capital moved further south. So when Washington's sworn in as president, he's sworn in New York City, which was the first capital of the United States in 1789. And then in 1790, the capital is moved right behind me to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, while they build a new capital further south on the Potomac River, known as the Federal City, and then eventually known as Washington City, and today known as Washington, D.C. So behind me, Philadelphia is the second capital of the United States, and it was the capital of the United States from 1790 to 1800, which means John Adams, the second president of the United States, is the first president to move into an unfinished White House in Washington, D.C., and actually serve from the nation's capital today, which makes Thomas Jefferson the third president of the United States, the first president to actually be sworn in to office in Washington, D.C. And every president since then has also been sworn in Washington, D.C., which, ironically, makes only one person Can you guess them? Only one person to serve as president of the United States who did not serve in Washington, D.C., and yes, that person would be George Washington, the namesake. So Hamilton spends most of his time as Secretary of Treasury right behind me, and some buildings off to the other side over there, and he creates the institution which becomes the backbone of the financial institution of the United States to this day. So while he's Secretary of the Treasurer, also Secretary of State Jefferson rises to the top, and them two are the two leading secretaries in Washington's cabinet, and they disagree on just about everything. They disagree on power. Jefferson's a states' rights guy. Hamilton's a federalist guy. He believes the federal government should have more power. Hamilton is for the Bank of the United States. Jefferson is against the Bank of the United States. Jefferson is for educating everybody. Hamilton is for educating your elites. Jefferson is pro-French. Hamilton is pro-English. And these are the two guys that are advising George Washington. At first, it's political differences. And then by Washington's second term, it grows into personal differences. And Jefferson and Hamilton do not like each other. And this drives George Washington nuts. So Washington is miserable in his second term. Jefferson and Hamilton both wind up resigning their posts, going back to their respective states, New York and Virginia. And this is mainly the reason why Washington does not serve a third term. His two most trusted lieutenants have deserted him and made his life miserable. So afterwards, Hamilton resurfaces. He's the ex-Secretary of the Treasury. In 1800, there's a very tight election between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and it is tied. It goes to the House. The House casts 35 ballots before the deadlock is broken, and on the last ballot, Hamilton uses his influence, which is still considerable, to get Jefferson elected over Burr. And this is one of the reasons why Burr dislikes Hamilton. And then in 1804, Hamilton is at a private dinner party. He makes some unkind, unflattering, ungentlemanly remarks about Aaron Burr, who is not at the meeting, but at the dinner party, but some of his friends are, and they go back and tell them. Things escalate to a duel, and Burr shoots and kills Hamilton. So Hamilton dies in 1804 after a duel at Weehawken, New Jersey, at the hands of Aaron Burr, who just happens to be the sitting vice president of the United States. So Hamilton did not live very long. You can do the math of 57 up until 1804. He's 46 or 47. But boy, did he pack a lot of years and a lot of living into those 46, 47 years. His big mark left on the country today is his financial contributions to Washington's cabinet, which basically leads sort of to the American financial system that we have today. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short but informative biography of Alexander Hamilton. And next time, you never know which corner we're going to show up on, so you better join us on Mr. Cornwell's Corner. See you next time.